FCC Radio.
So, before we go on to talk about some of the policy stuff that's happened with radio in the past couple decades, I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and what their role is and what they do. So, like I was saying in the very beginning, the whole reason we have the government getting involved with radio in the first place is because the broadband has limited frequencies, and there's a lot of radio interference. So the main role of the FCC is to make sure that stations aren't broadcasting on top of each other. For the most part, the FCC does not have the money and resources to be constantly listening to the radio, which means the FCC isn't really going to give you a hard time and come in and bust you or give you fines or anything like that unless they get a certain amount of complaints about you. So in addition to enforcing that there isn't a bunch of RF interference, they are also there to keep an eye on radio content. So, similar to the First Amendment, you can't be shouting out hate speech on the radio, and you also can't be saying like grave obscenities on the radio, in addition to doing, of course, calls to action, right? Like the government doesn't want us to mobilize, so you can't be mobilizing people on the radio, unfortunately. Another thing that you can get FCC complaints against is for swearing, excessive swearing. But there is some leniency when it comes to that. And from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the FCC has something that's known as safe harbor. And from those times, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., it's a little bit more lenient about the content that can be on the radio. And the justification for that is from like 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. The idea is that the populace of listeners is way higher and diverse, as in you could be having kids listening to the radio, so it has to be like clean, kid-friendly programming from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. But after 10 p.m., the amount of listeners is probably a lot lower. So the idea is that you can be a little bit more risque when it comes to your programming. So during that time, during Safe Harbor, you actually can swear on the radio to a certain extent. And what that means is, long as the swears you're using aren't referring to bodily functions, they're considered okay. For example, you can say, I'm pissed. Because in that case, pissed is referring to like, I'm angry or I'm drunk, if you're in England. But you couldn't say, I'm going to take a piss, because that implies that someone somewhere is... It implies that you're going to pee, and we simply can't have that. Similar to shit, you can be like, I hate that shit, as long as you're not talking about actual poop. So you could never say bullshit on the radio, because that implies that somewhere a bull has shat. Similarly, you can never ever say motherfucker on the radio, because it implies that a mom somewhere has been fucked. But you could say, like, I'm fucking over this, because in that case, fucking is being used as an emphasizing word, as opposed to, like, you couldn't say, like, I'm fucking, like, I'm having sex. Like, that's a huge, like, that doesn't fly with the FCC. So, within Safe Harbor, you can swear to a certain extent, as long as it's not referring to bodily functions. And like I was saying before, really, if the FCC gets enough complaints against you, pretty much what will happen is they will come in, or they'll start listening. That's when you're on their radar and they'll start listening to you. But before they start slapping fines on you or taking away your equipment, what they're going to be doing is giving you warnings, for the most part. So really it's important to remember when it comes to the FCC that like they aren't listening all the time unless they get a certain amount of complaints against you. And most likely those complaints are going to be based on interference or content. So now that we've talked a little bit about that, I would love to talk about what radio has looked like in the past couple of decades. So let's fast forward to 2000, where the government passed something called the Radio Broadcasting Prevention Act, which was pretty much, so another thing about broadcasting on these frequencies is for every frequency that has a broadcast on it, each frequency on either side of it needs to be clear. And the Radio Broadcasting Prevention Act was just saying as much, that there could not be low-powered or LPFM broadcasting on these secondary frequencies. That's what we call them, is the frequencies that are on either side of like high-power broadcasting are known as secondary frequencies. Which was a big problem because for the most part, localized radio is going to be low-powered and is probably going to be using these secondary frequencies. And then in 2003, applications came out for translators. And what translators are essentially signal doublers. And they were being offered to these big nonprofits and commercial stations so they could repeat their broadcasts and extend their range. Once again, I can't be sitting in Philadelphia talking about radio without bringing up the Prometheus Radio Project, which sprang out of the Radio Mutiny Collective here in Philadelphia. The Radio Mutiny Collective was a pirate station that operated out of Not Squat House on Baltimore Ave in West Philly in the 90s and early 2000s. But the Prometheus Radio Project sprang out of that, recognizing that in some ways it's fundamentally more radical to be working for actual policy change than it is to just be breaking the law. And as far as like whose voices get to be amplified in that case. So what Prometheus Radio Project was doing was a lot of advocacy work around radio. So then in 2003, when these applications for translators came out, Prometheus started doing so much lobbying. And in 2010, the Local Community Radio Act was passed. And what the Local Community Radio Act of 2010 said was that the FCC has to license local LP broadcasting in the FM band. And they needed to grant equal protection to community radio stations in regard to translator and booster stations. So these LPFMs would remain secondary to full power stations. And it also negated what I mentioned before in 2000, the Radio Broadcasting Prevention Act, which prevented community LPFM stations on the basis of RF interference. So that's what happened in 2010, and then Prometheus was doing these things called barn raisings, where they were going around the country and they were helping community stations build out their station, like to build antennas, to build consoles, in addition to teaching workshops to make sure, from everything from engineering to programming, to make sure that these community stations had the technical literacy that they needed in order to remain sustainable throughout the years. And then in 2013, it was a small window. I believe it was like only a week within October in which community stations could apply for these secondary frequencies, which I don't think I mentioned it before, but once you have your radio license and once you have applied for a frequency, you have that frequency for forever. And like I said, the FCC isn't really going to take away your license unless you do something like astronomically horrible, or you're like really just messing up like airplane communications or something like that. So it was a really big deal that all these applications, or that these applications were opening for these secondary frequencies, and everyone was just going for them, especially community stations. So yeah, like I said, what Prometheus Radio Project was doing was going around the country doing these barn raisings to ensure that these community stations had what they would need to succeed. And that's Prometheus Radio Project. They still exist today. A very, very cool resource that we're all lucky to have.